start by asking you just to react to the IMF forecast on your country. They've downgraded the growth forecast. Does that make you very angry, a little bit angry, or rather sanguine?
No, actually we had, as a central bank, upgraded our growth forecast in the September meeting. If you are the IMF, you are in the unfortunate position that you do it in April and you do it in October, so to say, whereas us as the central bank, we do it every 6 to 8 weeks. So we were not at all surprised because the IMF has just come to the same level that the South African Reserve Bank has as a forecast for GDP growth.
So you're very comfortable with the outlook on the current growth projections. No surprises expected before the end of the year.
Look, I mean, I think that our take is that if there are surprises, they are likely to be positive. But whichever way you look at it, where the growth is in South Africa is not where we would like it to be. Yes, we had managed to come out of the recession. It was a very strong bounce from having 2 consecutive quarters of contraction to have growth of 2.5%. So that was positive. I think that what at the heart of it is that South Africa needs to be driving the reforms necessary to lift the potential growth rate of the South African economy.
The bounce out of recession, I think, has been warmly welcomed, and investors are hoping that there is some sustainability now in the recovery. Could you characterize for us how sustainable you feel it will be running into next year? Because, of course, there are those who are pessimistic and feel it's fragile and that the politics in your country could derail that growth.
Yes, the politics could, but let's just look at what are the key drivers. South Africa still has a lot of catch up to do. This is the first time in a long time where we underperform global economic growth recovery, and so that already tells you that we have got a lot of scope to grow. Secondly, is that the global recovery is actually broad-based across regions, and more important for us in South Africa is that Euro area growth is expected to pick up, and the Euro area is a very important trading partner for South Africa. It is an important destination for manufactured products. So we are able to add value. We are hooked into the global value chains where we actually export to Europe. So that tells us that it is sustained. So thirdly, is that the South African economy has undergone some significant adjustments. When you asked about fragile, it's only 4 or 5 years ago that South Africa was characterized as one of the fragile 5. A lot has changed since then. We had fiscal consolidation being set on path. We had an adjustment on the current account side. We had 8 consecutive quarters, 8 consecutive months of trade surpluses. South Africa is now running a positive net international investment position, which then tells you that when there is going to be monetary policy normalization, South Africa has got its defenses in place, and we should be able to weather that storm quite easily. That tells you that the growth would be sustained. What are we worried about? We worried that potential growth in South Africa has come down, and as growth begins to accelerate, we might face a situation where the output gap closes at low levels of potential growth.
Well, you're a long way away, surely, from any problem with the output gap at this time closing, surely.
Well, we have revised our potential GDP growth to just around 1.2, 1.3%. We're expecting growth this year of 0.7%, accelerating next year to about 1.3, 1.5. So we are having a growth that would be picking up. Yes, it will take time for the output gap to close, but that is exactly the point that we are concerned about, that we actually need to lift the potential growth rate, because potential seems to have been eroded in the aftermath of the global financial crisis.
Clearly you won't be happy that the World Economic Forum moved you down 14 places in its competitiveness league tables. And it's the same old issues, accusations of cronyism in the government, accusations of corruption, large in those survey results. Can you offer anything new to overseas investors who are just continually frustrated with what they see as legal malaise in the mining sector, infighting politically across the country, and of course an ANC that at the moment seems to be gripped by its own internal battles over leadership rather than worrying about stability for the economy?
Well, you know, this you call this contestation, I call them contestations, you call them malaise. These contestations take place in the best of democracies. Actually, it is good that contestations about political leadership take place in any democracy. And of course, sitting from here in Washington, you could be saying, well, is this what the country needs at this stage? But well, you can't say that, I need a little bit of democracy. We shouldn't be having such big contestations we should have here. So we are a vibrant democracy. Some people think that we are a noisy democracy. So those contestations take place in the greatest of democracies. What is concerning is that in this contestation you have got policy uncertainty, because you're trying to figure out who is going to adopt which policy, and that does not bode well for investor confidence. But we will get this. We will get this behind us. We have been there. We have been there before. That issue that you had raised, which say that the concerns about cronyism and about corruption, and the fact that these things are actually coming out, the fact that South Africans are talking about these things is testimony to the strength of our institutions, that the institutions of our democracy are working, that South Africans understand that when they pick up these wrongdoings, they can utilize the institutions of our democracy to bring these things out. So whether you take the public protector's reports, or whether you look at the reports of the Auditor General, or you look at the judgments that the judiciary gives, you have a sense of a democracy that is underpinned by institutions that are functioning. Are we concerned about corruption in society? Of course we have got to be concerned about corruption in society. And strikingly is that elsewhere, when you were looking at a developing country, you would have said, oh, it's just a developing country problem. But the problem that we have, or what we have seen in South Africa and the work of our institutions, is that there are some big international players who have been exposed as being complicit in corrupt activities. And the fact that our institutions are able to expose this and engage with these things is testimony to a functioning democracy.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, Bell Pottinger, who I think you're referring to here, has clearly suffered significant consequences. Would you suggest then that ultimately KPMG should suffer significant consequences, and perhaps the Gupta family should just leave the country altogether?
Well, you know, it's not nice to talk about individuals or institutions that are currently not part of the conversations. Suffice to say that we have got institutions that deal with these kinds of malfeasance in the South African society. Those institutions must be given the space to deal with this malfeasance. South Africans themselves are raising these things very sharply. South African businesses are raising very sharply to the point where they would say, I will not be able to do business with this party or with this party because of the reputational risk that I would be exposed to. And I think that if you talk of institutions that might be accused of having turned their a blind eye to corrupt activities, to the extent that they are part of the regulated sector, the line regulators actually deal with them, and to the extent that there is crime that is committed, or complicity because crime was committed and was not reported about, our institutions should be able to deal with it.
So I just want to be very clear here. Are you suggesting, I mean, look, the allegations will be investigated
yes.
In either of those cases, but are you suggesting that actually businesses in the country will make their own decisions and probably hold off from transacting with either KPMG or the Gupta family.
You have seen those announcements coming up. So, again...
Is that the right thing, though, to happen?
Look, this is the view that we would take and have taken as a bank, to say that there are processes, allow these processes to take place and reach finality so that informed decisions could be taken place. But this is a free society. It's a free society, and various players in society are absolutely within their rights to take a posture that says that, no, I will not be able to do business with you or with that person, because these are private arrangements. I think what you are seeing now is South African businesses, instead of complaining about corruption and malfeasance, they are actually taking a stand.
Is that the bank's view as well, that actually financial stability in the country is best served by parties not doing business with those bodies that are under investigation?
If someone,
is that the bank's view?
No, but if someone is just under investigation, you need to allow the investigation to take its course. What we are saying is that we cannot interfere where individual businesses feel that the reputational risks to that particular business are actually just too high for them to continue in that respect. What we do say, though, you raised the issue of financial stability. The time when we get concerned about financial stability, we must know that in monitoring any risks to the financial system, you rely on returns. Those returns that you get from the regulated sector, they get looked at by auditors. And when you see a seal of stamp from the auditors, you take comfort that there is someone else looking at this stuff. As soon as there starts to be a question mark about that, then you start to have to raise your supervisory intensity and so forth. And so from where we are sitting from a public policy perspective, when we look at this, we say, what are the risks to financial stability, and what posture do we end up taking? And as a regulator ourselves, we understand very much the importance of process, whether it is a process with respect to investigation, or whether it's a process with respect to sanctions that end up being taken once the investigation has taken place. And these investigations should be allowed to take their course.
So, again, I just want to be clear. Are you saying it is possible that there could be sanctions against KPMG at some point?
I will not discuss the individual institutions. They are being investigated by the independent regulatory body in South Africa that called SARB, that oversees auditors. They themselves have taken a stance where they commenced with some investigations by KPMG International. They have just announced that they are going to have a completely independent review of their own practices. So I will leave that to them.
But obviously you've been in position for a very long time. You've seen the ebb and flow of these stories in the past. Do you feel that potentially here a new page is being turned for the country, that certain individuals and organizations that have long been pointed to as evidence of weakness in many parts of the government, that they are going to be cleaned out now, that actually there is a new opportunity?
Well, that I leave it to the strength of our institutions. I have got no doubt that given the tide now in society, our institutions will rise up to the occasion.
In the September meeting, you didn't move interest rates. Let's just talk a bit about policy here and move off that subject. That surprised the markets, who thought that you might have room to cut rates just to help stimulate growth a little further. To what extent is the weakness of the rand holding back the next move lower on interest rates?
The objective of monetary policy is not to bring rates down. The objective of monetary policy is to bring inflation down. And because inflation is down, rates can come down. So in the July meeting, our outlook for inflation over the next 12 to 18 months suggested that inflation will be firmly within our target. And actually at the time, we had very strong comfort that inflation is gravitating towards the midpoint of our inflation target band. And we expressed a view that we would actually prefer that inflation expectations are anchored closer to the midpoint of our target range. Come September, the inflation outlook had changed. We revised it marginally up. You mentioned the rent. It is one factor. The oil price is another. The fact that inflation expectations, in spite of inflation coming down, have not themselves come down was the other factor. But let's also get some things clear. You can take any of the central banks. It doesn't follow that when you change rates at one meeting, that every meeting that follows, you have got to do this the same thing. So the windows that we are looking for is windows that suggest that inflation is coming down, and because inflation is coming down, you would be able to bring down rates. But as we said in July, should there be an indication that inflation is on the rise rather than on the decline, we will not hesitate to change our stance.
But in terms of the signalling function from here, the fact that the market was taken by surprise, I think, means that the market hasn't quite understood the messaging that you're sending at this point. As we look towards the end of the year now and running into next year, is it your expectation that the bank will have a more dovish bias than a more hawkish bias, that you do believe that inflationary trends will weaken rather than strengthen?
Well, my knowledge of Avery is not very good. So these doves and hawks, I don't know where it comes from. Suffice to say that we have an inflation outlook over the next 2 years that suggests that inflation will be firmly within the target range. We would prefer that inflation expectations move towards the midpoint. We are constantly vigilant about it. We assess at every meeting what data had changed, and as you had earlier suggested, are we concerned about the rand? Of course we do get concerned about the rand. Why do we get concerned? Well, the rand is not just being driven by a realignment of exchange rates globally. The rand is also driven by South African idiosyncrasies that we had earlier talked about. We did provide guidance, by the way, after our September meeting. We indicated that we will be moving to a quarterly projection model, which is a gap-based model, which will look at the output gap, will look at the exchange rate gap, will look at the interest rate gap, and will also, importantly, look at the inflation gap, basically the deviation from of inflation, projected inflation from the midpoint of our target range.
So you're saying really it's a lot of structural issues that are making it difficult for you to move more quickly?
Yes, again, Geoff, you say move more quickly. The central bank must move more quickly on inflation. The narrative that I'm trying to correct is that the people in the market think that the objective of a central bank is to cut rates. The objective of a central bank is to protect the value of the currency, meaning that you must keep inflation contained. I mean, I guess your viewers in the developed world, when they hear this conversation, in the developed world, they are trying to generate inflation. Well, it looks like central banks are very good bringing down inflation than creating it.
Yeah. Would you offer any advice as to how they might create it?
Well, various countries differ. I can offer a lot of advice about the South African economy.
And just to wrap up then, where we came in on the IMF forecasts, as a proud South African, does it hurt you to think that Nigeria will now grow faster this year?
No, a growing Nigeria is very good for South Africa. South African businesses are very active in Nigeria. South African companies are big investors in Nigeria, and you might just find that the fact that Nigeria is growing faster gives a boost to the South African economy.